The morning sun cast a golden glow over the rugged terrain of the terraformed colony planet, Omega-6. Jake Carter adjusted his cap, the early breeze carrying a hint of metallic dust from the nearby scrapyard. His daily patrol was usually uneventful. A few stray animals, some rusted machinery, and the distant hum of automated harvesters. But today felt different. The air was heavy with an unusual silence, broken only by a faint rhythmic beeping. Jake stopped his old hoverbike and scanned the horizon. His eyes caught a trail of smoke spiraling into the sky. He revved the engine and sped toward it, his curiosity piqued. As he approached the source, his heart skipped a beat. Embedded in the rocky ground was a sleek, silver spacecraft, its surface scorched and dented as if it had fallen from a great height. Cautiously, Jake dismounted and approached the ship. The craft was unlike anything he'd seen, smooth, seamless, and emitting a faint hum. A jagged hole in the side revealed the damage from what must have been a catastrophic crash. Jake peered inside, his breath hitching as he saw her. She was slumped against the wall, her pale blue skin glistening faintly in the sunlight filtering through the wreckage. Her hair, white as freshly fallen snow, framed a delicate face that seemed oddly peaceful despite the situation. She wasn't human, that much was clear. Jake's instinct screamed at him to run, but something about her vulnerability held him in place. "Hey, are you okay?" Jake called out, his voice shaky but kind. Of course, she didn't respond. Her chest rose and fell in shallow breaths, a sign she was alive but unconscious. Without hesitation, Jake climbed into the wreckage, careful not to disturb the jagged edges of the broken hull. "All right, let's get you out of here," he muttered, lifting her gently. She was surprisingly light, her fragile frame almost weightless in his arms. Her attire was strange, a form-fitting suit with faintly glowing patterns that pulsed softly, like a heartbeat. Jake glanced at it nervously, half expecting it to explode or emit some alien toxin. But nothing happened. He carried her to his hoverbike and carefully secured her before taking one last look at the ship. It was a marvel of engineering, clearly far more advanced than anything humans had ever built. But it could wait. For now, the girl's safety was his priority. Jake rode back to his workshop, a sturdy structure nestled against the cliffs on the outskirts of the settlement. He placed her on a makeshift cot and examined her injuries. A small device on her wrist emitted a faint rhythmic beep, almost like a heartbeat monitor. Her breathing was steady, but there was a gash on her forehead that needed attention. Jake rummaged through his supplies, finding a clean cloth and antiseptic. "I hope this stuff works on you," he said softly, dabbing the wound. As he worked, he noticed her features more closely. The delicate lines of her face, the almost ethereal glow of her skin. She was beautiful, but in a way that was utterly alien. Hours passed, and Jake found himself sitting nearby, keeping an eye on her. He had so many questions. Who was she? Where did she come from? What had caused her crash? But for now, he had no answers. All he could do was wait. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Jake heard a soft groan. He turned to see her stirring, her eyes fluttering open. They were a vivid, piercing silver, filled with confusion and fear. "It's okay," Jake said gently, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. "You're safe." Her gaze locked onto his, and for a moment, neither of them moved. In that silent exchange, Jake realized his life had just changed forever. Lyra's silver eyes darted around the unfamiliar room, her breathing shallow and quick. The walls, the strange tools, and the unfamiliar scent of metal and oil overwhelmed her senses. She tried to sit up but winced as pain shot through her body. Her gaze landed on Jake, who was standing a few steps away with his hands raised, trying to look as unthreatening as possible. "It's okay," Jake said again, his voice calm and steady. He gestured toward himself. "Jake. My name is Jake." Liara tilted her head, her brows furrowing in confusion. Jake sighed and tapped his chest. Jake, he repeated, pointing at himself. Then he pointed at her. You? She stared at him for a moment before a soft sound escaped her lips. Lyra. Her voice was melodic, though laced with caution. Jake nodded, smiling slightly. Lyra. Got it. Nice to meet you, Lyra. He mimicked shaking hands in the air, but quickly realized it might not be a universal gesture. Lyra simply blinked at him, her expression unreadable. Jake rubbed the back of his neck, unsure of how to proceed. Communication was going to be a challenge. He pointed at a nearby glass of water, and then mind drinking. Water? He asked, holding it out to her. Lyra hesitated, her gaze flickering between him and the glass. Slowly, she reached out and took it, her slender fingers brushing against his. She sniffed the water cautiously before taking a tentative sip. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, and Jake let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. Progress, he muttered under his breath. As the minutes passed, Jake noticed the small device on Lyra's wrist flashing rhythmically. It looked like some kind of interface. He pointed at it and raised his eyebrows, silently asking for permission to inspect it. Lyra's hand instinctively covered the device, her expression wary. But after a moment's hesitation, she nodded slightly. Jake crouched beside her, examining the strange gadget. It was unlike anything he had ever seen. Sleek, with intricate patterns glowing faintly along its edges. He tapped it gently, and the device emitted a soft hum. A holographic interface flickered to life, displaying symbols that looked like a mix of geometric shapes and flowing script. Whoa, Jake whispered, mesmerized. This is way beyond anything we have. Lyra watched him closely, her silver eyes narrowing. She gestured toward the hologram and spoke a few words in her language, her tone firm but not hostile. Jake raised his hands in mock surrender. All right, I won't mess with it. Lyra pressed a series of symbols on the device, and suddenly, a soft voice spoke in halting English. Communication system activated. Jake's eyes widened. You've got a translator in there. Lyra didn't respond directly but spoke again in her language. The device translated, though the words were stilted. Where am I? Who are you? Jake grinned, relieved. You're on Omega-6. I found you after your ship crashed. I'm Jake Carter, just a regular guy trying to help. Lyra's expression softened slightly, though suspicion lingered in her eyes. Why? Help me. Jake shrugged. Seemed like the right thing to do. You looked like you needed it. She studied him for a moment, as if trying to gauge the truth of his words. Finally, she nodded, her posture relaxing slightly. Thank you, she said, the device translating her words with a slight delay. You're welcome, Jake replied. Now let's figure out how to get you back on your feet, and maybe fix that fancy ship of yours. For the first time, a faint smile tugged at Lyra's lips. Despite the language barrier and the vast differences between them, a fragile understanding had begun to form. Jake couldn't help but feel that this was only the beginning of something much bigger than either of them could imagine. The morning light streamed into Jake's workshop, illuminating the cluttered tables filled with tools, spare parts, and half-finished projects. Lyra sat on the edge of the cot, her silver eyes scanning the unfamiliar surroundings. The translator on her wrist hummed softly, ready to bridge the gap between their two worlds. Jake placed a steaming mug on the table in front of her. Tea, he said, gesturing toward the cup. It's warm. Good for you. Lyra hesitated, studying the cup as though it might explode. Jake chuckled and mind drinking from his own mug. She watched him closely before finally lifting the cup to her lips. Her delicate sip was followed by a slight widening of her eyes, and Jake couldn't help but grin. Good, huh? He asked, leaning back in his chair. It is different, the translator relayed after a pause. Her voice carried a note of curiosity, though her expression remained guarded. Jake nodded. That's how it is with new things. You'll get used to it. He gestured toward her wrist device. So, Can that thing tell me more about you? Like, where you're from or why you were flying through this part of space?" Liara stiffened, her fingers brushing over the device protectively. "I cannot say much," she replied through the translator, her tone cautious. "It is complicated." Jake raised an eyebrow, but didn't press. "Fair enough. Everyone's got secrets. But if you're going to stay here for a while, we might as well try to make this work." He stood and walked over to a large crate, pulling out a small engine part. "You said your ship is broken. Mind if I take a look? Maybe I can help." Liara's gaze softened slightly, her mistrust easing just enough for her to nod. "You will try to repair." Jake grinned. "That's what I do best." The two of them stood before Liara's ship, its sleek, damaged hull gleaming faintly under the sunlight. Jake circled it, his hands on his hips, whistling softly. "This is a beauty," he said. "Way more advanced than anything we got here, but it's banged up bad." Liara watched him work, her arms crossed as he climbed into the wreckage. His movements were methodical, his hands deftly assessing the damage. She couldn't help but be intrigued. Humans, she had been told, were a primitive species, barely scraping by in the vast galaxy. Yet this one moved with confidence, unafraid to tackle what looked impossible. "What's this?" Jake called out, pulling a jagged piece of metal from the console. "Looks important." Liara stepped forward, her translator humming. "It is the core stabilizer. Without it, the ship cannot fly." Jake frowned, turning the piece over in his hands. "Looks like it took a direct hit. Fixing this won't be easy." He set it aside and continued his inspection, occasionally muttering to himself. Liara found herself studying him closely. His hands were rough, his clothes worn, and yet there was an energy about him, a quiet determination that defied her expectations. "Why do you try to help me?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet. Jake paused, looking up from the console. "Because that's what we do," he said simply. "If someone needs help, you help them. Doesn't matter where they're from or what they look like." Liara tilted her head, her silver eyes searching his face for any hint of deception. But all she found was sincerity, plain and unpolished. "Humans are strange," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Jake chuckled. "Yeah, we get that a lot." By the end of the day, Jake had managed to jury-rig a temporary power system for the ship. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough to bring some of the systems back online. Liara watched as the console lit up, her expression a mixture of relief and awe. "You did it," she said, her translator struggling to keep up with her emotion. Jake wiped his hands on a rag, grinning. "Told you, fixing things is my specialty." For the first time, Liara smiled. A genuine, unguarded smile. In that moment, Jake felt a strange warmth in his chest. He didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Liara's presence was going to change his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine. The faint hum of Liara's ship's partially restored systems filled Jake's workshop as he leaned over the console, examining its data. Liara stood nearby, her arms crossed as she watched him. Her delicate features were calm, but her silver eyes remained sharp, taking in every detail of his movements. "This stabilizer core," Jake said, tapping a diagram on the console's holographic display. "It's too advanced for me to fix with the tools and materials I've got. But," he grinned, the spark of an idea forming, "I might be able to build something that can replace it temporarily." Liara's translator buzzed as she responded, her tone skeptical. "You believe you can create a solution for technology you do not understand." Jake shrugged, flashing a confident smile. "Humans are good at figuring things out. We call it improvising. It's kind of our thing." Liara's expression softened slightly, though disbelief still lingered in her eyes. "Your methods are unconventional," she said, "but I will not stop you." "Glad to have your permission," Jake teased, already heading to the cluttered shelves in his workshop. Hours passed as Jake worked. He rummaged through old parts, scavenged components from other projects, and occasionally cursed under his breath when something didn't fit. Lyra stood nearby, occasionally offering information about her ship's systems. Though their approaches were different, a strange rhythm began to develop between them. Jake's hands moved quickly as he soldered wires together, connecting a piece of salvaged machinery to a makeshift power source. "You know," he said, glancing at Lyra, "your ship's tech is amazing, but it's also really fragile. One hit, and it's done for." Lyra tilted her head, her translator responding. "Our technology is designed for precision and elegance. It is not meant to endure primitive environments." Jake laughed. "Yeah, I noticed. Humans tend to build things a bit differently. Stronger, but less elegant." Lyra hesitated before replying. "It is surprising. Despite your limitations, you continue to adapt." "That's what keeps us alive," Jake said simply. "When things don't work, we make them work." As Jake pieced together his improvised stabilizer, Lyra couldn't help but be impressed. He lacked the resources and knowledge of her people, yet he refused to give up. She had always viewed humans as an inferior species, but this one was proving her wrong. Finally, Jake stood back, wiping sweat from his brow. In his hands was a rough but functional stabilizer core, cobbled together from scrap and ingenuity. "It's not pretty," he said, holding it up, "but it should work. Let's see if your ship agrees." Lyra followed him to the ship, her heart pounding slightly. She had never seen such a crude device, yet Jake carried it with the confidence of someone who believed in their creation. He carefully installed the makeshift core into the ship's stabilizer unit, connecting it to the power supply. "All right," he said, stepping back. Moment of truth. He pressed a button on the console, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the ship's systems roared to life, lights flickering on and screens glowing with data. Lyra gasped, her silver eyes wide with amazement. "You did it," she said, her translator barely keeping up with her emotion. "This is unbelievable." Jake grinned. "Told you I could figure it out." Lyra's gaze lingered on him, her earlier skepticism replaced with something she couldn't quite define. "You are different from what I expected." "Good different, I hope," Jake said, his grin widening. She nodded slowly. "Yes, very different." As the ship hummed softly, Lyra realized that her perception of humans had been completely shattered. Jake's determination, creativity, and kindness were unlike anything she had ever encountered. For the first time, she began to wonder if there was more to humanity than she had been taught. Meanwhile, Jake leaned against the ship, watching Lyra as she inspected the revived systems. He had no idea what her world was like or why she had crashed on Omega-6, but one thing was certain: this was only the beginning of their journey together. The sun was setting behind the rugged hills of Omega-6, casting a warm orange glow over Jake's workshop. Inside, the hum of Lyra's ship mixed with the clinking of tools and the occasional frustrated groan from Jake. The makeshift stabilizer was working, for now, but Jake knew it wouldn't hold forever. He had to think of something better. Lyra sat nearby, her silver eyes fixed on the holographic display of her ship's systems. "The stabilizer core is functional," her translator relayed, "but it will not sustain the ship for long. Your creation lacks precision." Jake smirked as he tightened a bolt. "Precision isn't my style. Durability is. But I get it. It's not a permanent fix. I'll figure something out." "You are confident," Lyra observed, her tone carrying a hint of admiration. "Even when the odds are against you." "Confidence is half the battle," Jake replied with a wink. "The other half is stubbornness." Lyra tilted her head, intrigued by his humor. She had never encountered someone so persistent, especially when dealing with problems far beyond their understanding. She couldn't deny that his determination was fascinating and contagious. As Jake worked, Lyra began to assist him more actively. She explained how the ship's systems worked, her hands occasionally brushing against his as they examined components. Her knowledge was vast, but she lacked Jake's knack for improvisation. Together, they formed an unlikely team, blending her advanced technology with his rugged ingenuity. Jake rummaged through a pile of scrap parts, pulling out a heavy cylinder. "This might work," he said, examining it closely. "It's from an old mining drone. Strong, sturdy, and built to take a beating." Liara raised an eyebrow. "You believe this? Crude object can replace advanced alien technology." Jake shrugged. "It's worth a shot. Besides, crude doesn't mean useless. Sometimes simple solutions work better." He set the cylinder on his workbench and began modifying it. Liara watched in silence, her curiosity growing. Despite the roughness of his methods, there was an undeniable brilliance in the way he approached problems. Each step was deliberate, each adjustment carefully considered. As the hours passed, Liara found herself more invested in the process. She handed Jake tools, suggested improvements, and even helped test his ideas. Their differences became less of a barrier and more of an advantage. Jake's humor and relaxed attitude put her at ease, and she began to trust him in a way she hadn't thought possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake stepped back from the workbench, holding up the modified cylinder. "All right, this is it," he said, his voice filled with triumph. "The new stabilizer core. It's not pretty, but it's solid." Liara took the device from him, her delicate fingers tracing the rough edges. "It is unconventional," her translator said, "but it might function." "That's the spirit," Jake said with a grin. "Let's get it installed." Together, they returned to the ship. Jake climbed into the stabilizer unit, while Liara monitored the systems from the console. He carefully secured the new core, connecting it to the ship's power supply. Sweat dripped from his brow as he tightened the final bolt. "All right," he called out. "Try it now." Liara activated the ship's systems, holding her breath as the console flickered to life. The hum of the stabilizer grew steady, its rhythm strong and unwavering. A small smile tugged at Liara's lips as the ship's diagnostic screen displayed a single word: stable. "You did it," Liara said softly, her translator barely keeping up with her emotions. "We did it," Jake corrected, climbing out of the unit and wiping his hands on his jeans. "You're not so bad at this whole improvising thing." Liara glanced at him, her smile widening just enough to reveal her amusement. "Perhaps I have learned from the best." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the tension between them replaced by a growing sense of camaraderie. Liara realized that Jake's determination wasn't just a human trait, it was something she had come to admire deeply. And Jake, looking at her, felt the same. Their journey was far from over, but for the first time, it felt like they were facing it together. The glow of Liara's ship's repaired systems illuminated Jake's workshop, casting long shadows across the cluttered space. Jake leaned back in his chair, sipping on a mug of tea, while Liara meticulously reviewed the diagnostics. It had been a grueling few days of repairs, but the ship was finally stable enough to function, at least for now. "This stabilizer is holding better than I expected," Liara said through her translator, her silver eyes focused on the holographic display. "You have exceeded my expectations." Jake chuckled, resting his feet on the table. "I aim to please. Now you're one step closer to getting back to wherever you came from." Liara's gaze shifted toward him, her expression unreadable. "You assume I wish to leave immediately." Jake paused, lowering his mug. "Don't you? Isn't that the whole point of fixing your ship?" Before Liara could respond, a sharp, shrill sound pierced the air. Both of them froze, their eyes darting toward the console. The ship's sensors were flashing red, an alien script scrolling rapidly across the screen. "What's happening?" Jake asked, setting his mug down and rushing to her side. Liara's fingers flew over the console, her expression darkening. "A signal has been intercepted. My presence here is no longer hidden." Jake's stomach sank. "You're saying someone, or something, is coming for you. Lara nodded grimly. Yes, they are hostile. I was fleeing them when I crashed here. Jake ran a hand through his hair, pacing the room. Great, just great. How much time do we have? Not long, Lara replied. Their ships are fast. Jake's mind raced as he and Lara prepared for the inevitable. The two of them worked in tense silence, setting up basic defenses around the workshop. Jake gathered anything he could use: tools, scrap metal, even old mining equipment, while Lara used her ship's systems to monitor the approaching threat. Who are these people? Jake finally asked, breaking the silence. Why are they after you? Lara hesitated, her fingers pausing over the console. They are mercenaries, hired to capture me for reasons I cannot explain. Jake frowned but didn't push her for more details. All right. Well, whoever they are, they're not taking you without a fight. Lara's gaze softened slightly. You would defend me, even against such danger. Jake shrugged, grabbing a heavy wrench and testing its weight. It's not exactly my style to stand by and do nothing. Besides, I'm the one who found you. You're under my roof, which means you're my responsibility. Lara's lips curved into a faint smile, the first hint of warmth she'd shown since the alarm sounded. Humans are strange, but admirable. The night fell, and with it came an eerie silence. Jake and Lara waited, their nerves on edge as the minutes ticked by. Finally, a low rumble echoed in the distance. Jake stepped outside, his heart pounding as he saw a sleek, ominous ship descending toward the workshop. Here we go, he muttered, gripping his wrench tightly. Lara joined him, her translator buzzing softly. Their numbers are greater than ours. Jake grinned, though his eyes remained focused on the approaching threat. Yeah, but they don't have me. Or you. The mercenaries landed, their ship's doors hissing open to reveal a squad of armored figures. They moved with precision, their weapons gleaming under the moonlight. One of them stepped forward, pointing at Lara. Surrender, the leader demanded, their voice distorted through a helmet, or we will take you by force. Jake stepped in front of Lara, raising his wrench defiantly. Yeah, not happening. The mercenaries hesitated, clearly not expecting resistance from a lone human. Jake smirked, gesturing toward the workshop. You want her? You're gonna have to get through me. And this. At his signal, a makeshift trap sprung into action. Old mining drones activated, their mechanical arms swinging wildly as they charged the mercenaries. Sparks flew as the machines collided with the intruders, forcing them to scatter. Lara watched in awe as Jake moved with surprising agility, using his tools and traps to outsmart the mercenaries. Despite the chaos, he remained calm, his confidence unshaken. One of the mercenaries lunged at Jake, but Lara stepped forward, activating a small device on her wrist. A pulse of energy erupted, sending the attacker sprawling. She glanced at Jake, her silver eyes blazing. I will not stand idle. Jake grinned, his heart racing. That's the spirit. Together, they fought back against the mercenaries, their unlikely teamwork proving more effective than either could have imagined. For the first time, Lara felt a sense of belonging, a strange but undeniable connection with the human who had risked everything to protect her. The workshop was quiet again, but the silence was heavy with the aftermath of the battle. Smoke from the disabled mercenary drones lingered in the air, and the faint hum of Lara's ship seemed louder than ever. Jake sat on an overturned crate, cleaning the scuffed wrench he had used as a weapon. Across the room, Lara examined her wrist device, her silver eyes scanning the data with sharp focus. That was close, Jake said, breaking the silence. Too close. Lara nodded but didn't look up. They will return, her translator buzzed. In greater numbers. Jake leaned back, rubbing the back of his neck. Figures. These guys don't seem like the type to give up easily. Any bright ideas? Lara hesitated before speaking. My ship is functional, but not enough to escape their pursuit. We need time. Jake's jaw tightened. Time we don't have. If they show up again, we're in trouble. Liara glanced at him, her expression softening. You have done much already. I cannot ask more. Jake snorted, standing up. You're not asking. I'm offering. Look, I don't know much about your people or why these guys are after you, but you're here now. That makes this my fight too. For a moment, Lyra didn't reply. She simply watched him, her silver eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and something deeper, something she couldn't quite name. As the sun set, Jake and Lyra prepared for the inevitable. Jake fortified the workshop with everything he could find. Scrap metal barriers, electrified wiring, and more makeshift traps. Lyra, meanwhile, modified her ship's systems to enhance its defensive capabilities. Their work was fast and focused, driven by the knowledge that time was running out. As they worked side by side, Jake glanced at Lyra. So, you gonna tell me why these guys are after you? Might help to know what we're dealing with. Lyra hesitated before answering. I am important to my people. My presence here is a threat to those who oppose us. Jake raised an eyebrow. Important how? Are we talking royalty, military, or? She sighed. It is complicated. But if they capture me, they will use me to weaken my people. Jake whistled softly. No pressure, huh? Lyra's lips twitched in a faint smile. Your humor is strange, but appreciated. Night fell, and the workshop was bathed in shadows. The quiet was almost unbearable, each creak of the walls making Jake's nerves twitch. He stood near the entrance, a makeshift baton in hand, while Lyra monitored her ship's sensors. They're here, Lyra said suddenly, her voice steady but tense. Jake moved to her side, staring at the holographic display. Several blips were approaching fast, more ships than before. His grip on the baton tightened. All right, let's give them a warm welcome. The enemy ships descended, their engines roaring as they landed just outside the workshop. Jake and Lyra watched as the mercenaries emerged, their weapons gleaming under the pale moonlight. This time, their leader stepped forward, a towering figure clad in dark, menacing armor. Last chance, the leader said, their voice cold and mechanical through the helmet. Surrender, or you and your human companion will face the consequences. Jake smirked, stepping forward. Yeah, I've got a counteroffer. You leave, and I don't show you how creative humans can get with scrap metal. The leader's helmet tilted slightly, as if considering his words. Foolish, they muttered, raising a weapon. But before they could act, Lyra activated one of the traps. A burst of electricity surged through the ground, sending several mercenaries sprawling. Chaos erupted as Jake and Lyra launched their counterattack. Jake's traps sprung to life. Mining drones lunged, electrified barriers snapped, and improvised explosives sent shockwaves through the air. Lyra joined the fray, using her advanced wrist device to disable enemy weapons and create cover. Despite the overwhelming odds, their teamwork turned the tide of the battle. Jake fought with a mix of brute force and clever tactics, while Lyra's precision and agility kept the mercenaries off balance. The leader, however, remained standing, their armor absorbing every attack. They advanced toward Lyra, their weapon aimed directly at her. Jake saw the danger and didn't hesitate. He charged at the leader, his baton crackling with electricity. With a roar, he struck the mercenary, the impact sending both of them to the ground. The leader's weapon skidded away, and Jake scrambled to his feet, breathing heavily. Not so tough now, huh? He said, smirking. The aftermath of the battle left Jake's workshop in disarray. Broken tools, shattered drones, and scorched metal parts littered the ground. The faint hum of Lyra's ship was the only sound, a steady reminder of the task that still lay ahead. Jake sat on a makeshift bench, wiping grease off his hands, while Lyra inspected her ship's systems with meticulous care. We managed to fend them off, Jake said, breaking the silence. But they'll be back. And next time, they'll bring even more firepower. Liara nodded, her silver eyes focused on the holographic display. We must complete the repairs. Quickly. This ship is our only chance. Jake sighed, standing up and stretching. All right, let's get to it. What's left to fix? Liara pointed at a section of the hologram, a complex array of symbols flashing red. The propulsion system is still unstable. Without it, we cannot leave this planet. Jake studied the display, his brow furrowing. Looks like a mess, but nothing we can't handle. He smirked at Liara. You trust me, right? Her lips twitched in the faintest hint of a smile. I trust your unconventional methods. Jake chuckled. Good. Let's get to work. The next few hours were a blur of activity. Jake and Liara worked side by side, their movements synchronized despite their different styles. Jake handled the heavy lifting, welding and bolting pieces together, while Liara calibrated the delicate systems with her advanced tools. Their teamwork was seamless, the unspoken bond between them growing stronger with each task. As Jake tightened a bolt on the propulsion unit, he glanced at Liara. So what happens when you get this thing flying again? You go back to your people. Liara hesitated, her hands pausing over the control panel. That is the plan, she said softly. But it is not so simple. My return will bring consequences. Jake tilted his head. Consequences? Like what? She looked at him, her silver eyes filled with a mix of determination and sadness. My presence here is already a risk. My enemies will not stop, and my people may not understand. Jake leaned against the ship, crossing his arms. Sounds like you've got a tough road ahead. Liara nodded. I do, but it is my duty. Jake was silent for a moment, then shrugged. Well, for what it's worth, I think you're tougher than you give yourself credit for. You've got this. Her expression softened, and for the first time, she felt a sense of reassurance. Thank you, Jake Carter. As the repairs progressed, Jake encountered a particularly stubborn component in the propulsion system. He gritted his teeth, pulling at a jammed panel. Come on, you piece of junk, he muttered, his voice strained. Liara approached, tilting her head. You require assistance. Jake grinned, stepping aside. Be my guest. She extended her wrist device, emitting a precise beam of energy that loosened the panel in seconds. Jake watched, impressed. You know, that little gadget of yours is pretty handy. Liara gave him a rare smile. It has its uses. Together, they installed the final components of the propulsion system. Liara activated the ship's power core, and the entire vessel vibrated as the engines roared to life. The holographic display turned green, indicating full functionality. Jake let out a low whistle. Now that's what I call progress. Liara nodded, her voice steady but tinged with relief. The ship is ready. As they stood before the fully operational ship, a strange silence fell between them. Jake scratched the back of his neck. Well, I guess this is it. Liara studied him, her expression unreadable. You have done more than expected, more than anyone would. Jake shrugged, trying to hide the lump in his throat. Just doing what needed to be done. She stepped closer, her silver eyes locking onto his. You are remarkable, Jake Carter. He smiled, though his chest felt heavy. So are you, Liara. Go show your people what you're made of. Liara hesitated for a moment, then reached out and placed her hand on his. Perhaps this is not the end. Jake nodded, his grin widening. It better not be. As Liara boarded her ship and the engines roared to life, Jake stepped back, watching as the sleek vessel lifted into the sky. He felt a mix of pride and loss, knowing he had helped her but unsure if their paths would ever cross again. The morning after Liara's departure was quiet, but it felt heavier than usual for Jake. He stood outside his workshop, staring at the faint trail her ship had left in the sky. The barren landscape of Omega-6 stretched before him, empty and lifeless compared to the whirlwind of activity over the past few days. Jake had always been content in his solitude, tinkering with machines and fixing what others deemed unfixable. But now, a strange emptiness gnawed at him, a void left by someone who had become an unexpected part of his life. He sighed, running a hand through his messy hair. Well, back to the same old routine, he muttered to himself, though the words rang hollow. The next few days passed in a blur of monotony. Jake kept busy repairing old equipment for the settlement, but his thoughts often wandered back to Lara. Her silver eyes, her quiet determination, and the way she had begun to trust him despite their differences. It was a connection he hadn't realized he needed until it was gone. As he worked, Jake noticed something strange. The wrist device Lara had left behind on his workbench hummed faintly, its surface glowing with soft patterns. He picked it up, studying the intricate designs. "What's this all about?" he murmured. When he tapped the device, a small holographic message appeared. It was Lara's voice, translated into his language. "Jake Carter, if you are hearing this, then I have reached my destination safely. This device is a token of gratitude for your ingenuity, your courage, and your kindness. It also contains a signal. If ever you find yourself in need, or if you wish to find me, activate it. I will come." Jake stared at the hologram, his heart pounding. She had left him an open door, a choice he hadn't expected. A smile tugged at his lips as he pocketed the device. Guess it's not goodbye after all. Weeks turned into months, and life on Omega-6 resumed its usual rhythm. But Jake couldn't shake the feeling that his encounter with Lara had changed him. He worked harder, experimented more, and even began sharing his knowledge with others in the settlement. The once isolated mechanic was now a valued part of the community, though his thoughts often drifted to the stars. One evening, as Jake was packing up his tools, the ground beneath him trembled slightly. He stepped outside, scanning the horizon. A faint, familiar hum grew louder, and his heart raced. A sleek silver ship descended, its hull gleaming under the setting sun. Jake's breath caught as the ship landed gently near his workshop. The ramp lowered, and there she was, Lara, standing tall and radiant in the soft light. Her silver eyes met his, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Jake grinned, breaking the silence. "Couldn't stay away, huh?" Lara's lips curved into a rare smile. "It seems I owe you a visit." He laughed, stepping forward to meet her. "You could have called. I was starting to think you forgot about me." She tilted her head, a playful glint in her eyes. "Forgetting you would be impossible." As they talked, Lara revealed that her people had welcomed her return, though it hadn't been easy. She had shared her story of survival and of the human who had saved her. To her surprise, they were curious about Jake and his resourcefulness. "I told them humans are unique," she said, her tone soft. "You are proof of that." Jake smirked. "Unique, huh? I'll take it." Lara stepped closer, her gaze steady. "There is much to do, Jake Carter. The galaxy is vast, and your talents could change more than you realize." Jake raised an eyebrow. "You're saying I should leave this place? Travel with you?" She nodded. "If you wish. The choice is yours." Jake looked at her, then at his workshop, and finally at the sky. He had always been content with his small corner of the world, but now, the thought of exploring the stars with Lara sparked something inside him. Hope, adventure, and a chance to be part of something greater. He grinned, holding up the wrist device she had left behind. "Well, I guess I did say I'd find you someday." Lara smiled, her silver eyes gleaming. "Then let us begin." As the two boarded her ship, the engines roared to life, and for the first time, Jake felt like he was heading toward his true destiny. The stars stretched before them, full of endless possibilities, and Jake knew one thing for sure. This was just the beginning of an adventure he would never forget.